It was a year ago that Hurricane Katrina started out a devastating hurricane season for the Gulf Coast states, from Alabama all the way to Texas. We wanted to focus on how the electric co-ops have fared in this past year. Steve Johnson, who was a reporter and writer for Electric Co-op Today, was down in the Gulf states recently. Steve, how many co-ops did you visit?
I talked to about half a dozen co-op officials at various co-ops in the statewides at Louisiana and Mississippi. Drove around a little bit trying to get a sense of where the region stands a year from August 29, 2005, when Hurricane Katrina hit. The Electric Co-op Today went down to Mississippi and Louisiana last year, so this was kind of our one-year follow-up to see how far things have progressed, the challenges the co-ops have confronted, and how they've overcome them in the past 12 months.
We'll look at a few photographs you brought back with you, but generally, what was your impression about the restoration efforts?
The attitude of the people is really, really great. There seems to be sort of a self-sufficiency gene built into a lot of the co-op territories where folks say, look, this is terrible, but give me a shovel and I'm going to dig my way out of this and we're going to make this work. It might not be exactly the same as it was before, but it'll be what one co-op official called a new normal. We're going to establish businesses and commercial areas and homes over the long haul, over a long period of time. It's a painstaking job, but I didn't see anyone who was really sitting on their hands waiting for something to happen. The action was all very proactive, and it was very, very heartening.
What about remnants of devastation?
It's all over. It's still a situation in the Gulf where you turn to someone and say, what's your story? And they'll give you a story. And you turn to someone else and say, what's your story? And they'll tell you a story. Everybody has a unique story. The one thing, of course, is they're all really horrific stories in most cases, and the devastation was horrific. To date, a lot of the debris has been cleaned up off the roads, but if you go to the roadside along the beachfront in Gaucher, in Waveland, in Bay St. Louis, you still see a lot of pilings and beams that have been standing there just like they were standing there last August. The only difference is that they've been battered by a year's worth of the elements, and so in some cases they're even shiny and slick at this point.
Well, let's take a look at some of these photos. The first one we're looking at is that photo of the pilings along the Gulf Coast. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, you can turn almost anywhere along the coast of Mississippi especially and see the coastal homes that still are in a state of disrepair. A lot of owners have not returned. All you see are the beams and the pilings standing there on the edge of the water. A few hardy souls have pulled campers or trailers onto the concrete slabs that used to be their homes, but you still see an awful lot of devastation. That's why it's going to take years to rebuild the actual coast.
And this photo is representative of what you see?
Oh, I think there's no question about it. You see a lot of that down there. You see, of course, much more of that along the waterfront than you do further inland. That's a photo taken fairly soon after the hurricane struck. You can see the poles down, broken, twisted.
This is a cross arm.
Exactly. In Coast Electric's service territory in South Mississippi last year, they had 30,000 poles on the ground. I talked to one lineman when we were in Mississippi last week, and he had just retrieved his wife after the hurricane from a local church. And they're driving down the road, and they see the devastation and the ruin. And as he told the story, his wife said to him, "Baby, how are you ever going to work this out?" And he said, one pole at a time. That's exactly the way it was done.
When you look at a photograph like this, you just have to be amazed that it took that small amount of time.
In a lot of places, they just set new poles and strung new lines and came back and picked up the fallen stuff later on. It would be more difficult to try and resurrect what was broken than it was just to start from scratch.
Here's a photograph of a lineup of trucks. It looks like an army getting ready to move into town.
It really was the Army last year when the hurricane hit. You consider the thousands and thousands of co-op crews that came from out of state to rebuild power. Now, the interesting thing as you look at the trucks like this is that out-of-state workers did not leave Mississippi until March. They were required that long to be able to make all the system improvements, and there are still a number of out-of-state contracting crews, not co-op crews, but contracting crews in certain areas of the state tending to maintenance and construction.
Now, this is a residential neighborhood. Nice truck in the garage of what must have been a very expensive house.
You have to remember the storm surge in some cases was 20, 25 feet high. You had some homes where the second story looked unaffected, But the first floor, as you can see in here, was just eviscerated.
Now this is just a mess. Nothing left but cinder blocks.
And there's still a lot of scenes like that in Mississippi. A lot depends upon whether people have decided to move back into their houses or whether they flooded inland to higher ground. In just about all cases, all the meters that can accept power's been restored to them, but there's a lot of people who just never came back.
Did you get a sense in talking to the co-op managers and staff what kinds of numbers the folks who didn't come back represent?
Singing River EPA lost about 3,500 accounts. We know the Coast EPA lost about 12,000 accounts. That's a tremendous amount of accounts. They each had about 70,000.
Here we have a photo of well, it looks like at one time was a very substantial building by the size and the look of the stairway leading up to nowhere.
Yeah, that is a stairway to nowhere. Along the coast, where you have subdivisions with streets, one house next to another, the storm surge was so strong that it would knock the first house down. And then, in almost a domino effect, it would blow the first house into the second house and knock the second house down. Then the second house and the first house, the remnants of that would knock a third house down. So the houses along streets in the bayous and the coves of Mississippi and Louisiana literally toppled like a house of cards.
We've seen this picture of thanks going both ways. Thanks from the residents who appreciated getting their power back on. We also saw some photos from the line crews thanking the local residents.
It really was a two-way street. The line crews came and saw the problems that existed and worked diligently day and night in very, very difficult conditions to bring back power to the distressed areas. But a lot of linemen tell stories about how they were touched by the community. For example, one family told a lineman I talked to last week, "Look, if you can get our power back on, we'll grill dinner for you." And he did, and they did. So crews and the people really developed a bond during the hurricane recovery. Once people see the lights start to come back on, maybe it's not their own light, but maybe it's a street light, or maybe it's their neighbor's light, then you get a little sense that maybe things are starting to come back to normal. It's something to hang on to, and in a devastated area like this, you cling to any straw you can find, and electricity is a very good one to grab onto. When I talked to the folks at the Mississippi statewide, they had two aerial photos, and one was South Mississippi and the rest of the state lit up at night, and as you pass over the state you could see the little points of light in the communities along the beach. Of course, a lot of lights there in central Mississippi. And then they had a shot of Mississippi right after Katrina, and it was totally dark. It was astounding. You see the contrast between light and darkness, and the co-op crews brought people out of the darkness, literally and figuratively.
You have to ask yourself, have people now taken a different look towards material goods and their comforts, wealth, the furniture, the things that surrounded them prior to the hurricane?
I think a lot of them have, not in every instance obviously, but a lot of people that Electric Co-op today has talked to over the last year have all said, well, it was just possessions, it was just things. They can be replaced. What can't be replaced is the human life. And survival became paramount in the immediate aftermath of Hurricane Katrina.
Do you have a transformer still tethered to a pole, sitting on a tree, wrapped with swaddling clothes? The lineman's wife was right. How are you going to take care of all of this stuff?
Well, you found transformers and everything else in just the oddest places. The most remarkable thing we encountered last year when we went there was that part of a palm tree was stuck in wires. I have no idea how the palm tree got there. Far inland, some workers actually had to cut a palm tree out of distribution lines.
This is an interesting photo, and it's very descriptive and direct in its message. Does this kind of thing reflect the bond that you talked about between the line crews and the consumers?
Sure it does, and it's nice to see the big X over the word no and the yes, we do have power at the end of the road. You know they're grateful for it to even go to that step of spray painting a hand-fashioned sign and sticking it on their property.
It almost reflects to some degree a sense of humor.
Yeah, well, you have to see humor in just about everything, even gallows humor sometimes in the case of Hurricane Katrina, because you're not left with a whole lot else. But the people, even today, can laugh about it, joke about it, despite their losses. It really makes you appreciate the way they've come back from this storm.
Here's a photograph of a gentleman with a high-powered rifle. Steve, that looks rather ominous.
It is if you're an alligator. This is one of the quirky little stories that you found in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. That is a sharpshooter from the Jackson County Sheriff's Department, and he does have a high-powered rifle there. And if you see in the background, he's looking over the edge of a swamp. Some poles and some distribution lines have fallen into that swamp, and workers are trying to raise them. But because it is a swamp and because it's Mississippi, there are alligators present. And the sharpshooter's sole mission is to protect the line crews that are going into very dangerous conditions.
Here we have a photo of a nice boat just sitting on dry dock.
50,000 boats destroyed during the storm. 400,000 vehicles of some kind destroyed during the storm.
Here's another photo of a nice house with the front ripped off, and perhaps this family is not as bad off as some others. They're proclaiming that. They're saying we're okay.
We're okay, and they also have on the front of their house the FEMA claim number, their insurance company, so when the insurers drive through the areas, they can see quickly which home they cover and which homes they don't. We saw a lot of signs last year saying 4 people survived in this house, or we're going to rebuild on this site, or we're going to come back. It's kind of a very visual way of thumbing your nose at Katrina.
Here we have a photograph that's reminiscent of that old The Next Greatest Thing photo of the 4 linemen pulling a new line through areas that had not been energized. But here you have a modern Katrina version, yanking as hard as they can.
Sure, when we first saw this, we thought this was the lineman equivalent of Iwo Jima. What they're actually doing, in fact, is using the rope to hoist a very heavy transformer into place. It does have that slight Iwo Jima monument quality to it.
The back end of this truck says Katrina bound. One of the threads through all of these photographs is people were using spray paint and signs to communicate to one another.
You had to go back to almost the Stone Age to communicate, because the appurtenances we take for granted today, cell phones, they didn't work. Cell phone towers were destroyed. There were no landline communications of any kind, no internet communications, nobody's checking their email. For several days in every single co-op that we visited, both in 2005 and in 2006, you'll hear co-op managers, they'll say the hardest thing right after the storm were the lack of communications. Most people knew only what they could see, or they'd send a scout party out like it was the Civil War to try and go a couple miles down the road and report back.
In this high-speed day and age, it's hard to fathom. Well, here we're looking at a pole, wire. This looks fairly recent.
One of the lingering effects of Katrina are what officials in Mississippi and Louisiana call Katrina trees. And that is to say, the trees where the wind from last year or the storm surge and the brine water has put the trees on life support but not brought them down to the ground yet. So every time a thunderstorm or a strong gust of wind passes through parts of Mississippi, even 50, 60 miles inland, a lot of people experience power outages from trees that are not on co-op right-of-ways. But the Katrina tree problem will continue to knock down lines and poles for years to come.
Before we started this, you said that there was an odor that permeated a lot of the area.
It was the smell of rotting food, of waterlogged carpets and debris, of dead animals, and you never could get that stench quite out of your nose for quite some time to come. The pictures of destruction show you visually what it's like. Until you had that extra sense brought in, the sense of smell, it's really very, very difficult to get a full feeling for the magnitude of the storm and the destruction it left behind.
Steve will leave our tour of these photographs with this optimistic picture of linemen doing what they do best.
So many linemen that we've talked to said they still experience the after effects of Katrina on a daily basis. Not a day goes by when they don't have something to do that relates to the fallout of last year's storm, and that'll continue for a long time. If you consider the cleanup efforts, the fine-tuning of the system that's necessary, in many cases you'll find them going to underground lines now rather than above-ground lines, and then the remarkable growth, especially along the Mississippi Gulf Coast, that's leading to any number of subdivisions being constructed, new commercial businesses, new industry. It's going to present quite a challenge for co-op